"Sir, this ticket does not belong to you, and I will be calling security to have you removed from this gate right now." The words came out loud, loud enough for 3 rows of waiting passengers to turn their heads, loud enough for a child to look up from her coloring book, loud enough to hang in the recycled airport air, like something that could not be taken back. Sandra Briggs stood behind the Gate B12 counter at Chicago O'Hare Terminal 3 on a Tuesday afternoon, with the particular posture of a woman who had performed authority for so long she had stopped being able to tell the difference between authority and cruelty. Her platinum blonde hair was sprayed into a stiff helmet that caught the fluorescent light with every small, impatient movement of her head. Her manicured nails tapped a quick rhythm against the desk. Her uniform was pressed to a crease so sharp it could have cut something. She had worked this gate for 11 years, and in that time, she had developed a very specific sense for who belonged in first class, and who was attempting something they had no business attempting. The man standing in front of her did not, in her estimation, belong. Elijah Cole was in his late 40s, with the kind of face that had learned over decades to show people exactly as much as he intended, and nothing more. He wore a plain gray hoodie, dark jeans, and a pair of scuffed boots that had seen a lot of airports. His carry-on was dented at one corner, in the way bags get when they have been checked too many times. Nothing about him announced anything. He was the kind of man you might sit beside on a train for 2 hours, and if asked later to describe him, remember mostly as quiet and very still. He was very still now. Sandra held up his boarding pass and examined it with the theatrical suspicion of someone performing a scene they had rehearsed internally many times before, then announced to the surrounding gate area, not to Elijah specifically, but to the gate area, that this documentation looked fraudulent, that she had seen this exact kind of thing before, that people always thought they could get away with it. Then she tore it in half. The 2 pieces drifted down between them and settled on the polished terminal floor near his scuffed boots. Elijah looked down at them. Then he looked back up at her. He did not speak. He did not reach for his phone. He did not raise his voice or step back, or do any of the things that the 200 people now watching from their gray plastic seats might have expected a man in his position to do. He reached into the inner pocket of his hoodie and produced a second boarding pass, gold-lettered embossed with a chairman's reserve designation that caught the light in a way the first pass had not, and held it out toward her. Sandra waved it away without looking at it. What nobody in Gate B12 knew, yet what Sandra Briggs could not have known, because she had not looked at his documents carefully enough to know anything, was that in less than 15 minutes, she would discover that the man she had just publicly humiliated in front of 200 witnesses held the single most important business contract in the financial life of this airport hub, and that she had just torn it in half and dropped it at his feet. Margaret Holloway. Peggy, to everyone who knew her, was 62 years old and had spent 34 of those years teaching American history to 8th graders in Columbus, Ohio, which meant she had spent 34 years trying to explain to children that the past was not as far away as they wanted it to be. She was sitting near Gate B13, waiting for a connecting flight to Denver, and she had been watching the situation at Gate B12 develop with the particular attention of someone who recognized the shape of what was happening even before she could name it precisely. She opened her phone, slowly turned the camera on, and began recording, not because she planned to post it anywhere, but because something in her told her this needed to be documented, the same instinct that had made her save every piece of student writing that ever moved her. 3 rows behind Peggy. Frank Delaney, 68, retired Chicago firefighter, white-haired and broad-shouldered in the way of men who spent decades carrying weight, leaned forward in his seat and muttered to the woman beside him that what he was watching was dead wrong, which was the strongest language Frank typically used in mixed company. Sandra, having disposed of the original boarding pass, had picked up her desk phone and announced over the gate intercom that there was a disruption at Gate B12 and that Flight 1947 to Atlanta might experience delays due to an uncooperative passenger. The framing was precise and deliberate. She was the professional managing a situation, and Elijah was the situation being managed. Several passengers who had not been paying attention now turned to look. 2 TSA officers arrived within 2 minutes. Officer Torres, 17 years on the job, a man whose instincts had been sharpened by enough real situations to make him immediately uncomfortable with what he was reading here, and a younger partner whose discomfort was less professional and more basic. The discomfort of a person watching something that simply looked wrong. Elijah held out the chairman's reserve pass again calmly without comment, and Sandra announced to no one in particular that digital tickets were even easier to fabricate than printed ones, that she had seen this specific kind of scam run through her gate before, and that she was not about to be fooled by gold lettering on a phone screen. Peggy's hand tightened around her phone. Frank Delaney stood up. Frank walked to the desk, the way men who have spent their lives moving toward emergencies walk steadily without drama, as though the space between his seat and the counter had simply needed to be crossed, and so he was crossing it. He told Sandra in the straightforward tone of a man who had never learned to speak sideways that he had personally watched this gentleman check in at the first-class counter approximately an hour ago without a single problem, and that what he was watching now did not look like security protocol to him. Sandra turned to Frank with the full force of her 11 years of terminal authority and told him that if he continued to involve himself in an airline security matter, she would have him removed from his own flight. Frank looked at her for a long moment and did not move back toward his seat. Supervisor Janet Holloway arrived from the back office approximately 90 seconds later, and it was evident from the moment she rounded the corner that she had already made her decision before she had heard a single word from Elijah. Janet was in her mid-50s, with silver-streaked blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun and reading glasses perched on her nose that she looked over rather than through when she wanted to convey that she was not impressed by what she was seeing. She had managed gate operations for 19 years and had developed a very efficient method for handling passenger complaints, which was to identify quickly which version of events her own staff had committed to and build outward from there. She sided with Sandra before asking Elijah a single question. She then stepped to the PA system and announced, with the smooth, regretful tone of someone who genuinely wished things were different, that Flight 1947 to Atlanta might be delayed due to a disruptive situation at the gate, and that the airline apologized for any inconvenience. 200 passengers groaned collectively. Several pulled out phones. A grandmother with a rolling cart looked up at the announcement board with the expression of someone who had been through this before and was very tired of it. Officer Torres, who had been examining both the torn pieces of the original boarding pass and the chairman's reserve document on Elijah's phone screen, with the careful attention of someone who took legitimacy seriously, told Janet quietly that the documentation appeared completely valid by every standard he could assess. Janet told him with a politeness that did not reach her eyes that decisions regarding ticket authenticity were made by airline personnel and not by TSA officers, and she appreciated his assistance, but would handle things from here. Elijah had still not raised his voice. He had barely moved. And his absolute stillness, the quality of a man who had decided that he had nowhere to be but exactly where he was, had begun to do something strange to the people watching, which was to make them more uneasy than any argument could have. Janet leaned slightly toward him and told him that he had 60 seconds to walk to the main counter and purchase an economy class seat, or she would instruct Officer Torres to escort him from the terminal. Elijah looked at her steadily and said in a voice that was barely above conversational that someone was on their way. Janet laughed, not warmly and not long, but unmistakably. Sandra announced to the gate area that nobody was coming, that it was time to stop wasting everyone's time, and that this had gone on long enough. The gate area did not agree, but most of it stayed quiet. Elijah's phone buzzed once in his jacket pocket, and he glanced at the screen, the way a person glances at something they were already expecting. Not surprised, not relieved, just quietly recognizing that the sequence of events was now proceeding as it needed to. He answered in 2 sentences. He said he was at gate B12 and asked that Raymond come down now. Then he ended the call and put the phone back in his pocket. Janet instructed Officer Torres to proceed with the escort. Torres looked at Elijah, then at his partner, then back at Janet, and the pause he took before stepping forward lasted perhaps 2 seconds longer than it should have from a purely procedural standpoint, because Torres was a man who had spent 17 years developing the judgment to know when a situation was what it claimed to be, and when it was something else entirely. And this situation was something else entirely. He stepped toward Elijah. Elijah said with the same quiet steadiness he had maintained for the last 12 minutes that he would ask them to wait just 1 moment. Janet said that was not going to happen. Peggy Holloway's phone battery was at 14%. She did not stop recording. Frank Delaney had not moved from where he was standing, which was close enough to the desk that everyone could see he had not moved, and that he did not intend to. From the far end of Terminal 3 moving through the afternoon crowd, with the contained urgency of a man carrying information he very much wished he did not have to deliver, came Raymond Alt, the airport's director of operations, silver-haired, wearing a charcoal suit that had been perfectly pressed that morning, and was now carrying the slight dishevelment of someone who had moved faster than his position usually required him to move. His Italian leather shoes made quick, precise sounds on the marble floor, and people stepped aside without entirely understanding why the way crowds part for a certain quality of purpose. He came directly to Elijah without looking at anyone else first. He extended his hand with the careful formality of a man who understood that the gesture was also a form of acknowledgement, not just a greeting, but a public declaration of where he stood. He said Mr. Cole loudly enough that the entire gate area heard it clearly, and something in the way he said it, with the slight breath of a man who had been hurrying and was now making himself slow down and be precise, told everyone listening that those 2 words were the beginning of something much larger than a name. Janet's expression, which had held the confident blankness of someone certain of her position, changed. It did not collapse all at once. It changed the way a wall changes when something structural behind it gives way, not immediately visible, but present in the quality of the stillness that followed. Sandra's nails stopped their tapping. Raymond turned to face the crowd, and then he began to speak. Raymond Alt had been the director of operations at O'Hare for 9 years, and in that time, he had managed runway emergencies, weather diversions, a security breach that shut down 2 terminals for 6 hours, and a labor dispute that very nearly grounded the entire airport on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. He was not a man who frightened easily or spoke carelessly. He was frightened now, and he chose his words with the precision of someone who understood that every syllable was being recorded from at least a dozen angles. He introduced Elijah Cole by his full name and title, founder and chief executive officer of Cole Meridian Group, and let those words settle before he continued. Cole Meridian Group, he explained to the gate area, held the primary federal infrastructure contract that funded 31% of this airport hub's entire operating budget. Not a portion of it. Not a secondary revenue stream. 31%, the kind of number that when it goes away does not leave a gap, but a collapse. The crowd processed this in the particular silence of people doing arithmetic they did not expect to be doing in an airport terminal on a Tuesday afternoon. Janet's reading glasses slid down her nose. She did not push them back up. Sandra's hand, which had been flat on the counter since Raymond walked in, did not move. Her platinum hair caught the fluorescent light the way it always did, but somehow it seemed less like authority now, and more like something that had been arranged very carefully to look like authority, which is a different thing entirely. Frank Delaney, still standing where he had stood throughout everything, exhaled slowly through his nose, in the manner of a man who has just watched something he suspected all along turn out to be exactly what he thought it was. Peggy kept recording. 8% battery, Raymond continued. Mr. Cole, he said, had been traveling to Atlanta today, specifically to begin the final discussions on a 7-year contract renewal, the agreement that directly supported 17,000 jobs across the regional hub network, the paychecks and healthcare plans, and retirement contributions of 17,000 families, who would never know that their futures had nearly been derailed by a torn boarding pass and a woman who did not look at her evidence before making her decision. Elijah had not moved, had not spoken since Raymond arrived, had not adjusted his expression or his posture or the angle of his carry-on on his shoulder. And in the context of everything Raymond had just said, his stillness was not passivity. It was the most powerful thing in the room. The silence of a man who had known from the beginning exactly who he was, and had simply been waiting for the room to catch up. Near the window, Don and Beverly Marsh, both in their early 60s retired teachers from Naperville, who had been waiting for their flight to visit a daughter in Georgia, sat very close together. Beverly reached over without looking away from Elijah and found Don's hand and held it the way people hold on to something solid when the ground shifts. Janet recovered first, which was perhaps the most professionally impressive thing about her 19 years of managing crises, had given her a kind of reflexive composure that could reassemble itself even after something this large, at least on the surface. She turned to Elijah with the careful professionalism of someone trying to find a foothold on very unstable ground, and she began the word, misunderstanding. Elijah interrupted her, not with volume, not with sharpness, but with a single quiet question delivered in the same unhurried tone he had used for the past 15 minutes. Was it he then laid out what had happened in the precise, unhurried sequence of a man who had been paying very careful attention, not because he had been preparing to use it against anyone specifically, but because clarity was the only thing he had been able to offer the whole time, and he was still offering it now. His boarding pass had been examined and declared fraudulent, then torn in half. The pieces had been dropped at his feet in front of 200 people. He had been told loudly in public, in a voice intended to carry that people like him always tried to game the system. He had produced a second document with chairman's reserve status, and it had been waved away without examination, with the explanation that digital tickets were easy to fabricate. He had asked to speak with a supervisor, and been told that he was already speaking with the supervisor. A witness who stepped forward to confirm his legitimate check-in had been threatened with removal from his own flight, and then security had been called to escort him from the terminal, each point in the same measured, quiet tone. Not accusation, not performance. Just a factual record of what had occurred delivered in front of everyone who had watched it occur. Janet had no response. There was no response to a factual account of what 200 people had personally witnessed, which meant that any attempt to reframe it would happen in full view of everyone who knew better. Elijah turned to Sandra directly, and with complete devastating calm, asked her what specifically had made his documentation look fraudulent. Sandra opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. She started 3 sentences in the next 30 seconds, and was unable to finish any of them because every sentence that began honestly led somewhere she could not go with everyone watching, and every sentence that began as a defense collapsed under the weight of what the people around her had seen with their own eyes. Peggy's phone died. She lowered it. She had been watching with her own 2 eyes for 15 minutes, and she would remember everything she had seen with a clarity that no battery percentage could threaten. Frank Delaney said from where he was standing without anger, in the straightforward tone he used for all important things, that they had all heard what Sandra had said about people like him, and that everyone present understood what that had meant, and that no protocol had required her to say it. Under the terminal's fluorescent lights, Sandra's platinum hair seemed to lose some of its architecture, as though the confidence that had been holding it up had quietly decided to go somewhere else. Raymond's phone rang, and he looked at the screen, and then he looked at Elijah, and then he held the phone out toward him with the expression of a man handing over something that had become, in the space of 15 minutes, much larger than a phone call. It was Patricia Gaines, Chief Executive Officer of North Star Airlines, calling from the company's corporate jet somewhere over Indiana, which meant she had received the news at 35,000 feet and had still managed to sound like a woman in command of a situation that was very rapidly escaping anyone's ability to command. Raymond propped his tablet on the gate counter so the screen faced outward toward the crowd, an instinct that he would later describe as one of the better professional decisions of his career, because it meant that what was about to happen happened in full view of everyone who had been there from the beginning, and there was something about that that mattered. Patricia Gaines appeared on the screen well composed, in the way of executives who have been trained to project composure even when composure is the last thing that comes naturally, but visibly shaken at the edges, a slight tension around the eyes, a careful deliberateness in how she was holding herself that told anyone who looked closely that she was working very hard to appear less alarmed than she was. She began with an apology. Elijah raised one hand, not aggressively, not dismissively, but with the calm authority of a man who wanted to make sure the foundation was understood before anything was built on it, and stopped her. He said quietly and clearly that he wanted her to understand the context in which they were speaking before she continued. Approximately 200 people were watching this conversation directly, and many more were recording it on devices that would carry it considerably further. This was not a private matter between executives. It had not been a private matter since the moment Sandra Briggs had made her decision at the desk, loud enough for a child to hear. Patricia's expression on the screen adjusted the particular recalibration of someone who has just understood that the conversation they prepared for on the flight down is not the conversation they are actually having. Elijah spoke to her in the same measured tone that had characterized everything he had said since he arrived at Gate B12, and he told her 4 things. The first was that Sandra Briggs needed to be terminated today, not suspended, not reassigned, terminated with a permanent flag entered into the industry hiring system. Not because he wanted her destroyed, but because the pattern of behavior that produced this morning was not a momentary lapse, and a suspension communicated that it might be. The second was that Janet Holloway should be suspended for 90 days without pay with mandatory bias, accountability training required, before any reinstatement review, and that the review itself should be conducted by an external committee, not North Star's internal management, because internal reviews of internal failures had a well-documented tendency to find what they were looking for. The third was that North Star Airlines would implement a full customer-facing bias review across all of its gates, not announced with a press release, and quietly forgotten, but audited externally every 6 months, with the results published where any passenger could read them, because accountability that happened in private was not accountability, it was record-keeping. The fourth was a contribution of $400,000 to 2 civil rights organizations. He named not to rehabilitate North Star's reputation, but because the money had a better use than sitting in a corporate legal reserve fund, waiting to settle the next incident quietly. Patricia said yes to all 4 without negotiating a single one. Elijah said there was a 5th thing. The gate area went quiet in the particular way of people who understand that what they are about to hear is the most important part. The 5th requirement wasn't financial. It was not procedural. It was personal. Patricia Gaines would write the public apology herself, by hand first, then typed in plain language, without legal review, without passive voice, without the word alleged, or the phrase customer experience, or any of the other constructions that companies use when they want to appear to say something without actually saying it. A direct statement that North Star employees engaged in racial profiling at Gate B12 on a Tuesday afternoon, and that the leadership of the company took full responsibility for the culture that had made that possible. Posted publicly within 24 hours. Patricia was quiet for a moment, long enough that the gate area felt it. And then she said, "Yes." The applause that came from the crowd at Gate B12 was not the reflexive kind, not the kind that follows a performance, because performance expects it. It was the applause of people who had been holding something tight for 45 minutes and had just been given permission to put it down. Raymond closed the tablet. The video call ended, and the gate area, instead of dispersing the way crowds usually do when the thing they gathered to watch has concluded, stayed. Not all of them. Some people had flights to catch lives pulling them back into their own currents, but a substantial number of the people who had been there since the beginning remained near Gate B12 in the way that people sometimes linger after something they know they witnessed but haven't yet fully processed. Peggy Holloway made her way toward Elijah with the deliberate walk of a woman who knew what she wanted to say and was going to say it regardless of whether the moment felt right for it or not, because she had been a teacher long enough to know that the moments that feel perfectly right for saying the important thing almost never arrive. Her phone was dead. She had no footage left. But she told him she had taught American history for 34 years, and this was the first time she had watched someone defend their dignity in a public confrontation, without losing even a small piece of it in the process, and that she wanted him to know she had seen it. Elijah thanked her genuinely in a way that made it clear he understood that standing there with a dying phone had not been nothing. Frank Delaney came over and shook Elijah's hand, with both of his, the way men of Frank's generation sometimes do, when they mean something more than a handshake can technically contain. He did not say anything complicated. He said that was right, which was for Frank a complete and sufficient statement. Dawn and Beverly Marsh, the retired couple from Naperville, approached together. Beverly told Elijah with the directness of a woman who had raised 3 children and taught Sunday school for 20 years that she wanted her grandchildren to know this had happened. Don nodded in the way he had been nodding at everything Beverly said for 41 years, which was to say with the full conviction of a man who knew she was right. Officer Torres addressed Elijah in the professional tone he used for formal statements and said that he had found the documentation completely legitimate throughout, and that he wanted to acknowledge that he had come very close to executing an action he would not have been able to justify on review, and that he was sorry for the role he had nearly played. Elijah told him with a directness that Torres would remember for some time that Torres had conducted himself with integrity under considerable pressure from his own supervisors and bore no responsibility for the orders he had very nearly and very reluctantly followed. Renata James, a Delta flight attendant, 58 years old, 22 years of skies behind her, had stopped on her way to another gate and watched the entire thing from the edge of the crowd without recording it. She was not a person who processed things quickly, but she was a person who processed them thoroughly, and she filed what she had seen in the place where she kept the things that were going to require her to do something differently going forward. Sandra Briggs stood behind the desk where she had worked for 11 years. She had not spoken since the video call ended. Her hands were flat on the counter. The platinum helmet of her hair caught the light exactly as it always did, but there was nothing behind it that resembled the woman who had torn a boarding pass in half an hour ago. Janet Holloway was not at the desk. She had stepped away during the video call and was standing near a window overlooking the tarmac, her reading glasses folded in her hand, looking at the planes moving in their slow, precise patterns below without appearing to see any of them. Raymond Alt arranged for Elijah's boarding new printed pass, Chairman's Reserve First Class, no delay in apology that he offered quietly, and that Elijah accepted without ceremony. Elijah shouldered his carry-on, the same dented bag he had arrived with, the same gray hoodie, the same scuffed boots, and walked toward the jet bridge. He paused at the door, turned back once toward the gate area, and looked at the people who had stayed. He did not give a speech. He did not raise a fist or point toward anyone or make any gesture that could have been photographed and made into a symbol. He just looked. And then he walked down the jet bridge and was gone, 19 hours after the incident at Gate B12. Terminal 3 was in the gray pre-dawn quiet of an airport, before the first wave of morning flights, the particular hush that falls over large public spaces when the people who populate them haven't arrived yet, and the space belongs briefly to itself. Sandra Briggs arrived at the employee entrance at her usual time, which was 5:40 in the morning, her badge in her hand, operating on the muscle memory of 11 years of the same routine. A security officer she recognized, but whose name she had never learned, was waiting for her at the door, and he walked with her to Human Resources without explaining where they were going, because she already knew. Carolyn Reeves, North Star's Director of Human Resources, was already there. The termination letter was already printed and sitting in the center of the desk, and Carolyn read the key language aloud, with the careful neutrality of a woman who had delivered difficult things many times and understood that her job in this room was precision, not comfort. Discriminatory conduct incompatible with company values. Violation of federal customer protection standards. Effective immediately. No severance package. A permanent flag entered into the North Star hiring system and shared across the industry consortium database, which meant that every major carrier, every regional affiliate, and every ground operations partner in the network would see her name and know why it was there. Sandra asked one question in a voice that was quieter than her voice at Gate B12 had been, which was whether there was any appeal process. Carolyn said the decision had been made at the executive level, ratified by the board, and was not subject to appeal. Sandra signed where she was asked to sign, and then she collected her personal items from Gate B12, a coffee mug that had been a gift from her daughter, a printed photograph of the two of them at the lake, taped to the inside of a drawer, a small desk calendar with 11 months of shift notes written in red pen. She put them in a cardboard box that Carolyn had left for her, and then she walked out of the terminal for the last time. The security officer walked beside her in silence because there was nothing useful or honest he could say, and he was a man who understood the difference between filling silence and breaking it. Sandra sat on the bench outside the terminal entrance, where she had sat 100 times before, on breaks, eating lunch and watching the travelers come and go. The early morning sky above the airfield was the color of old pewter. Planes moved in their slow, distant patterns overhead. The smell of jet fuel sat in the cold air, the way it always did, the smell she had associated for 11 years with purpose and routine. She sat with her box on her lap, and she did not call anyone. She thought about Elijah's question, not the demands he had made on the video call, not the moment when Raymond had said his name and the whole gate had shifted, but the quieter question he had asked her directly before any of that, when it was still just the two of them at the desk and the crowd watching. What specifically made my documentation look fraudulent, she had not been able to answer then. She could not answer now. And the inability to construct an honest answer to that question, the fact that every honest attempt led to the same place, which was a place she had been living in for so long she had stopped being able to see. Its walls was the thing that pressed against her chest in a way that the termination letter had not. She had not been following protocol. She had been following something older than protocol, something that had settled into her understanding of the world so gradually that she had stopped experiencing it as a decision and started experiencing it as a perception, as simply the way things were, the way she could tell who belonged and who was attempting something. She had been wrong, not just procedurally, not just legally. She had been wrong in the way that mattered most, which was the way that had nothing to do with job performance and everything to do with who she had become without noticing. She stood up, eventually picked up the cardboard box, and walked toward the parking garage in the early morning light. She did not look back at the terminal. There was nothing back there that was hers anymore. Janet Holloway signed her suspension paperwork in Carolyn Reeves's office at 9:15 the same morning, with the resigned efficiency of a person who has already done her grieving privately and has arrived at the formal part of the process, ready to get through it. 90 days without pay. Mandatory completion of a bias accountability program developed by an external organization unaffiliated with North Star. Reinstatement review conducted by a committee of 3 people, none of whom would be North Star employees, a civil rights attorney, an organizational psychologist, and a passenger rights advocate, nominated by the same civil rights organization that had received a portion of the $400,000 contribution. Carolyn explained this last detail carefully, and then added something that Carolyn had clearly been instructed to convey. Specifically, the external review committee had been Elijah Cole's personal requirement, not North Star's. He had not asked for Janet's termination. He had asked that she be given the genuine possibility of return, not a guaranteed return, but a real one, on the condition that it was evaluated by people with no institutional reason to minimize what had happened. Janet absorbed this in the silence of a woman receiving information that required her to revise something she had been thinking. The man she had tried to have escorted from her terminal had specifically argued for her second chance. Not as a gesture and not as forgiveness, he had been clear with Patricia Gaines that this was a principle that he did not believe in consequences that had no proportionality to harm, but as a structural choice, because he believed that accountability without any pathway forward was punishment wearing accountability's clothing. She drove home through Chicago morning traffic on roads that had carried her to and from this job for 23 years, past the same exits and overpasses she had driven past enough times to stop seeing, and she thought about the moment she had arrived at Gate B12 the previous afternoon. She had come around the corner from the back office, and she had seen the situation in a fraction of a second. Black man in casual clothes, her agent managing the situation, a small crowd developing, and she had made her decision in the same fraction of a second, before she asked a question, before she looked at a document, before she spoke a single word to the man she was about to try to have removed from the building. 4 seconds. She had been managing gate operations for 19 years, and in 4 seconds, she had made the decision that undid it. The worst part was not that it had been a bad decision. The worst part was that she had not experienced it as a decision at all. It had felt like a reading of the situation, like using experience and professional judgment, the things she was supposed to use. And the fact that she could not clearly identify the moment it had stopped being professional judgment and started being something else was the thing that made the 90 days ahead of her feel necessary rather than punitive. She got home. She made coffee. She didn't drink. She picked up the training packet Carolyn had given her and opened the first page and began to read in the kitchen of the house she had lived in for 20 years, at a table that had held a lot of difficult mornings and could hold one more. Elijah Cole landed in Atlanta 3 hours after departing Chicago, took a cab from the airport to the North Star Contract Partners offices in Midtown, and sat in a conference room for 4 hours, going through the preliminary terms of a 7-year renewal agreement that, if finalized, would keep 17,000 people employed across a regional network that most of them would never think about as a single connected thing. He did not mention what had happened at O'Hare. Not once. Not as context, not as a point of leverage, not as a story. The meeting was about the contract, and the contract was what mattered, and he had learned a long time ago that the most powerful demonstration of professionalism is the ability to do the work regardless of what the day cost you to get there. At the end of 4 hours, he signed the preliminary agreement that would begin the formal 7-year renewal process. The people across the table from him shook his hand, offered him water, and then coffee, and one of them, a woman in her late 50s, who had managed federal infrastructure contracts for 30 years, said that it was always a pleasure working with Cole Meridian because you always knew exactly where you stood. Elijah thanked her and meant it. On the flight back to Chicago that evening, he sat in his window seat as the sky outside deepened from orange to purple to the particular blue-black of a country seen from above at night, lit from below in scattered constellations that were actually cities, and he let himself be still in a way he had not been able to be still since 5 in the morning. He thought about his father. His father had driven a Chicago City bus for 31 years, the same routes, the same roads, the same shifts, and had been a man of extraordinary dignity, who was almost never addressed as such by the world he moved through. He had been called boy by passengers, young enough to be his grandchildren, and had said nothing because in the arithmetic of his life, saying nothing was survival, and survival was everything. He had never had leverage. He had never held a contract or a title or a phone call with a CEO. He had had his uniform and his route, and the particular pride of a man who did his job every day without needing the world to acknowledge it. The leverage Elijah now carried had not made today less painful. It had made it survivable in a way his father's daily injuries never fully were, and there was something in that difference that Elijah carried quietly and did not talk about, because it was the kind of thing that had no good outlet and required only that you not forget it. He closed his eyes over Indiana somewhere, the plane carrying him north through the dark, and let the exhaustion of the day settle around him like something that had earned the right to be there. Patricia Gaines landed in Atlanta at 7 in the evening and went directly to North Star's regional offices without stopping anywhere. First, which was the kind of thing you did when you understood that the thing waiting for you at the office was more important than anything that might happen if you delayed it. Her legal team had prepared 3 versions of a public statement, which she found on the conference table when she arrived. She sat down and read all 3. Then she set them aside. The first one used the phrase alleged conduct. The second referred to a customer service experience that fell short of our standards, which was the kind of sentence that technically said something while meaning nothing. The third was the best of the 3, and still opened with 4 sentences about North Star's history of commitment to customer dignity before it arrived at anything resembling an acknowledgement of what had actually happened. She put all 3 in the folder and closed it. She sat alone at the conference table for 40 minutes with a yellow legal pad and a pen, and then she wrote the statement herself by hand, the way Elijah Cole had specifically asked her to. It was 2 paragraphs. It did not use the word alleged. It did not use the phrase customer experience or fell short of standards or any of the other grammatical constructions that create the appearance of accountability while evading its substance. It said, in plain declarative sentences, that North Star Airlines employees had engaged in racial profiling at Gate B12 in Chicago O'Hare on a Tuesday afternoon in full view of 200 witnesses, that the behavior was discriminatory and wrong, and that she, Patricia Gaines, Chief Executive Officer, took full personal responsibility for the culture within her company that had permitted it to develop. It named the 4 commitments Elijah had required, and then added a 5th that had been her own idea, a standing annual report on bias-related incidents across all North Star customer touchpoints, published publicly every January, available to any passenger who wanted to read it. She typed it herself, posted it to North Star's official accounts at 11:47 in the evening, and went to her hotel. By 6 the following morning, the statement had been shared 340,000 times. The comments came from all over the country from people in their 60s and 70s and 80s who said they had been waiting a long time for a company to say something that was actually true and meant it and had not been written by a lawyer. North Star's customer service line received 4,700 calls in the next 48 hours. The majority were not complaints. They were people calling to say they would keep flying North Star because of what they had seen. 3 weeks after the incident at Gate B-12, Peggy Holloway was back in her kitchen in Columbus, Ohio, on a Tuesday afternoon, the same day of the week, though she had not planned it that way. The garden outside her window had gone dormant for the season, the hydrangeas cut back to their woody stems, the beds covered in straw mulch, the way she always put them to bed in November. She had thought about Gate B-12 every day since she came home. Not obsessively, not in the way that disrupts the ordinary shape of a life, but the way you think about something that is settled somewhere deeper than memory, in the category of things you have witnessed, that rearranged something in you, that your understanding of the world is slightly different on account of having seen. She got out her good stationery, the cream-colored paper she saved for letters that mattered, and she wrote to Elijah Cole at the Cole Meridian Group address she found on the company website. She had written a great many letters in her life. To school boards that were making decisions she believed were wrong. To city councils about library funding. To the parents of students who needed someone outside their own household to say in writing that they saw something remarkable in their child. She was a person who believed that the written word delivered through the mail carried a weight that no other form of communication quite replicated the weight of effort, of deliberateness, of having chosen to make something permanent. This letter was different from all of those. She told him about her 34 years in the classroom and about teaching the civil rights movement to children who had grown up in a world that told them it was history. Finished, resolved, filed away when she knew, and had always known, that history of that kind does not file away. It simply changes the clothes it wears. She told him that what she had watched at Gate B-12 was not simply a man defending a legal right to a seat he had purchased. It was a demonstration of something she had spent 3 decades trying to teach, and almost never found a clean example of that power, exercised without restraint, corrodes the person who holds it, and power exercised with restraint commands in a way that force never can. She sealed the envelope and walked it to the mailbox herself, rather than leaving it for the carrier, because some things you should walk to the end of your own driveway to send. 2 weeks later, a handwritten note arrived at her house on Cole Meridian Group stationery. 3 sentences written in a hand that was careful and unhurried. The last sentence said that what she had done staying recording, not looking away, had mattered more than she knew. She read it twice. Then she taped it to the inside of her kitchen cabinet door, where she would see it every morning when she reached for her coffee cup. Frank Delaney did not write any letters and did not post anything online, because Frank was not a person who processed things by talking about them or sharing them, and because, in his estimation, what he had done at Gate B-12 was not something that required processing. He had stood where he thought he should stand, and then he had come home, and that was the whole of it. What he did the following week was this. He was in a department store on the north side of Chicago, picking up a birthday present for his youngest granddaughter, and he noticed a black teenager being followed through the electronics section by a security guard who had not started following him until the moment the kid walked in. Frank watched it for about 30 seconds, long enough to be certain of what he was seeing, and then he walked over and stood beside the teenager and said to the guard in his direct and unhurried way that he didn't think that was necessary. The guard looked at Frank for a moment and then moved away. The teenager looked at Frank, and Frank just nodded in the way he nodded at things that were simply what they were, and then he went back to looking for his granddaughter's present. He would not have described this as significant. He would have described it as what you do. Renata James, the Delta flight attendant who had watched the whole thing from the edge of the crowd at Gate B-12, carried what she had seen differently, the way some people carry things that require them to do something about it before they can put it down. She had worked commercial aviation for 22 years, and she had looked away from things she should not have looked away from. Not out of cruelty, out of the particular fatigue that comes from working in a system that rewards de-escalation above all, where de-escalation often meant removing yourself from the situation, which meant leaving someone alone in it. 2 weeks after she got home, she filed a voluntary report with Delta's Internal Diversity Review Office, describing what she had witnessed at Gate B12 and asking specifically what her company's protocols were for a Delta flight attendant who witnessed discriminatory treatment of a passenger by another airline staff. The question she was really asking was whether her training had prepared her to stay. Delta's response surprised her. They told her the question was important, thanked her for raising it formally, and 6 weeks later invited her to participate in a cross-airline working group on passenger dignity standards. She said yes without hesitating. Don and Beverly Marsh told their grandchildren about it at Sunday dinner the week they got home. Beverly said a man kept his dignity when someone tried to take it from him, and it mattered that we were there to see it. Their 14-year-old granddaughter, who was sitting across the table doing the thing teenagers do, where they appear not to be listening, while listening to everything asked, quietly, "Did he get angry?" Beverly thought about it for a real moment, the way she thought about questions that deserved a real answer. "No," she said. "He was better than angry." 6 weeks after the incident, Elijah Cole boarded a morning flight at O'Hare. Different gate, different airline, different Tuesday. Wearing the same gray hoodie and carrying the same dented carry-on bag that had accompanied him through 100 airports in 20 years of building something from nothing into something real. The gate agent was a young woman who smiled when she scanned his pass and said, "Enjoy your flight," Mr. Cole with the easy warmth of someone who meant it, and Elijah said thank you and meant that, and walked down the jet bridge into the morning without thinking about Gate B12 even once. He thought about where he was going, which was where his mind had always been, most at home, forward, toward the thing that wasn't finished yet, toward the work that waited for him, with the patient reliability of work that knows it will get done. Sandra Briggs did not return to the airline industry. She took a job at a garden center in the western suburbs, early hours, physical work, no uniform, no designation, no authority to perform for anyone. And she learned over the first weeks that there was a particular kind of tiredness that comes from years of performing a self and a particular kind of rest that comes from stopping. One morning in December, a black customer came in looking for hydrangeas for a spot on his back porch that didn't get much sun. And Sandra walked him through the options without thinking about it, and they talked for a while about winter mulching and what survives a hard freeze, and she drove home afterward, with the conversation sitting in her quietly in a way she didn't fully understand. She did not know if that was enough. She suspected it was not. But it was where she was, which was further than where she had been, and she was trying to learn to count that honestly. Gate B12 at Chicago. O'Hare looks exactly the way it always has. The same long rows of gray seats, the same departure boards cycling through its steady procession of cities, the same fluorescent light that makes everyone look a little more tired than they actually are. Peggy Holloway's phone recording never went anywhere. It was never posted, never shared, never turned into anything. Just saved in the photo album of a retired school teacher in Columbus, who sometimes opens the wrong folder by accident and finds it there, a grainy, dimly lit 45 seconds of a black man in a gray hoodie, standing absolutely still in the middle of a crowded terminal, surrounded by noise and confrontation, and 200 strangers looking at no one and nothing, waiting with the complete and unshakable patience of someone who has always known precisely who he is and was never for a single moment in any doubt about it. She has never shown it to anyone. She doesn't need to. Some things you keep because keeping them is the point. If you've ever watched someone refuse to be made smaller, subscribe to our channel. There are more stories like this one, and they deserve to be told.